Here's what we know for certain. On the morning of Monday, January 23, 2006, Jennifer Kesse called her boyfriend. The conversation sounded completely ordinary. She was getting ready for work, talking about the day ahead. Nothing unusual. Nothing alarming. No panic. No warning. No sign that anything was wrong. To everyone around her, it was just another Monday morning. Routine. Predictable. Normal. And then, Jennifer Kesse vanished. She was expected at work less than an hour later, but she never arrived. At first, it didn't seem alarming. Traffic, a delay, something ordinary. But later that day, her car was discovered roughly 2 kilometers from her apartment, parked carefully, almost deliberately. There were no obvious signs of violence, no visible struggle, no message explaining what happened. Nothing that immediately made sense. It was as if someone had simply erased the middle of the story. Jennifer Kesse disappeared 18 years ago. The investigation remains officially unsolved. There is a person investigators wanted to identify. Someone captured on surveillance footage near Jennifer's car. A possible witness. Or possibly more than that. But there is one detail that turned this case into one of the strangest missing person investigations in America. The surveillance camera captured the individual at exactly the wrong moments. Every single frame was blocked by the fence posts. For years, investigators have had video of a person connected to the timeline, walking, moving normally, potentially holding the answer. And yet, their face has never been clearly seen. Orlando. January 2006. A city most people associate with vacations, theme parks, tourists, endless sunlight. A place designed to feel safe. Crowded streets, hotels full of strangers. Thousands of people moving past each other every day, without ever really noticing one another. And that creates a strange contradiction, because in a place where there are always people around, it can become surprisingly easy for someone to disappear unnoticed, especially when at first glance, everything looks completely normal. January doesn't feel like winter. It feels like sunlight, warm air, blue skies, an ordinary morning that gives you no reason to feel afraid. This was not the kind of place people associated with danger. Not the kind of day that feels like the beginning of a tragedy, which is exactly why what happened next became so difficult for people to process. Because some disappearances happen in darkness, and some happen in broad daylight, in places that feel completely safe. Jennifer Kesse was 24 years old. And that detail matters, because cases like this often get reduced to headlines. A missing woman, a cold case, a photograph on the news. But Jennifer was not an abstract story. She had a real life, a routine, plans, people who expected to hear from her again. She grew up in Coral Springs. She graduated from college, built a career, and by 2006, she was working as a project manager for a construction company in Orlando. To the people around her, Jennifer seemed responsible, organized, independent. Someone building an ordinary adult life, which makes what happened next feel even more unsettling. Because people like Jennifer are not supposed to simply disappear. Friday, January 20th, 2006. Jennifer Kesse finishes work and leaves for a short trip to the Virgin Islands with friends. For the next 2 days, everything appears completely normal. The beach, photographs, laughter, a weekend away from routine. Some of the final photographs ever taken of Jennifer come from that trip. In them, she's smiling. Sunday evening, she returns to Orlando. Later that night, she speaks with her boyfriend, Rob. It's a long conversation, nothing unusual. She sounds tired from the trip. She says she's going to sleep. They say goodnight. No one realizes it will be the last normal evening of her life. This timeline is important. 7:45 a.m. Monday morning. Jennifer Kesse makes her final known call to Rob. After that, the timeline narrows dramatically. Investigators believe she disappeared sometime between roughly 8 o'clock and 8:30 a.m. About 30 minutes. That's the window. 30 ordinary minutes inside an otherwise ordinary morning. By 9 a.m., Jennifer has not arrived at work. By 10 o'clock, Rob can no longer reach her. Calls go unanswered. At around 2 p.m., he contacts the police. And according to later accounts, he's told to wait. At that moment, nobody yet understands that those first few hours are the most important in any disappearance case. At around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Rob calls the police, and this is where the first major point of controversy in the case begins. According to later reports, he was told that Jennifer was an adult. Adults have the right to leave voluntarily, and so he should wait. 24 hours. 24 hours. Even though her phone was unreachable. She had missed work without explanation, and the people closest to her insisted this behavior was completely out of character. Now, to be fair, there is a common misconception that police departments legally require a 24-hour waiting period for missing adults. In many jurisdictions, that is not actually true. But in practice, cases are sometimes treated differently in the earliest hours. And in missing person investigations, the earliest hours are often the ones that matter most. Tuesday, January 24th, 2006. Jennifer Kesse's vehicle is located at the Huntington-on-the-Green apartment complex in Orlando. A green Chevrolet Trailblazer. At first glance, nothing appears chaotic. The vehicle is parked carefully. The doors are closed. The vehicle appears secured. No obvious signs of a struggle. Investigators begin looking inside. Her purse is there, her phone, her apartment keys, the kinds of things people normally take with them, especially if they intend to leave voluntarily. But one thing is missing: the car keys, which means someone most likely drove that vehicle there and then walked away. Investigators begin speaking with residents. Neighbors. People who lived nearby. Anyone who might have noticed something unusual. But the answers are almost identical. No one heard a struggle. No screams. No obvious disturbance. Nothing memorable. There were surveillance cameras in the area, including cameras facing parts of the parking lot where Jennifer's vehicle had been left. So investigators requested the footage. And at that point, the case changed completely. Because the cameras captured exactly one person connected to the vehicle. One figure, walking calmly through the frame. And what happened next became one of the most unsettling coincidences in modern true crime. Then investigators review the surveillance footage, and they see someone, a man walking through the parking lot that morning, right within the estimated timeline, roughly between 8 o'clock and 8:30 a.m. The footage immediately becomes central to the investigation, because this person may have parked Jennifer's vehicle and walked away. The figure appears to be of average height, dark clothing, possibly work overalls or coveralls. And then investigators notice something almost impossible: the camera angle. The fence beside the walkway, frame after frame, the person's face is blocked. Every single time. For just a fraction of a second, the fence posts align perfectly with the camera's view. Again, and again, and again. The investigation had video of someone connected to Jennifer's disappearance, but not one clear frame of their face. Investigators search Jennifer Kesse's apartment. At first glance, nothing appears disturbed. No signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture, no indication of a struggle. Everything appears normal. Except for one small detail: the blinds near the terrace door. They were slightly open. Not fully, just enough to see outside. It may have meant nothing, or it may have meant someone was watching the street below, waiting for the right moment to leave, or waiting for someone to arrive. In cases like this, investigators learn to pay attention to details most people would never notice. Now, this is where the case becomes more complicated. At the time of Jennifer Kesse's disappearance, her apartment complex was still under construction. Workers moved through the property every day: contractors, painters, maintenance crews. People in work uniforms were everywhere, and that detail matters, because the individual seen in the surveillance footage appears to be dressed like a worker, which creates two very different possibilities. The first is completely innocent. The person may actually have been a worker, someone who happened to be nearby at the wrong moment in history. But the second possibility is harder to ignore. What if the clothing itself was intentional? A disguise hidden inside normality, not to stand out, but to disappear into the background. Because in a place where everyone wears coveralls, nobody remembers the man wearing coveralls. But regardless of which explanation is true, both point toward the same conclusion. Whoever was involved likely understood Jennifer's routine. They knew where she lived. They knew when she usually left for work. And they acted during a very narrow window of time. That is one reason investigators have often questioned whether this was truly random. Because statistically, crimes of opportunity tend to involve unpredictability. This case does not feel unpredictable. Everything about the timeline suggests timing, awareness, preparation, which raises a deeply unsettling possibility. Someone may have been watching Jennifer long before she disappeared. After Jennifer disappeared, some residents began remembering small things that had once seemed unimportant. A man seen near the parking lot, standing around without any obvious reason, watching, waiting. At the time, nobody thought much of it. Apartment complexes are full of unfamiliar people: visitors, workers, delivery drivers. No one memorized his face. No one wrote down a license plate. No one contacted management. Because at the time, there was no reason to believe anything dangerous was happening. That's one of the most unsettling parts of cases like this. the warning signs rarely look like warning signs in real time. Only afterward do ordinary moments begin to feel different. Over the years, investigators and behavioral analysts have pointed to several details that continue to stand out in this case. First, whoever was involved appeared organized. The timeline was tight, the vehicle was relocated, and very little physical evidence was left behind. That usually suggests planning rather than impulse. Second, the surveillance footage raises difficult questions. Whether intentional or coincidental, the only footage capturing the individual shows them from an angle where the face is consistently obscured. Some investigators have wondered whether the person understood the camera layout beforehand. And third, everything happened fast. Very fast. Investigators believe Jennifer disappeared within a window of roughly 30 minutes, in daylight, near occupied apartments, during the morning rush, which suggests whoever did this likely knew exactly how little time they had. Over time, the case began raising difficult questions about the investigation itself. Not necessarily corruption, but missed opportunities, mistakes that can never be reversed. Investigators were criticized for how slowly the case initially moved. There were also reported issues involving records connected to workers at the apartment complex. At the time, the property was still under construction, and identifying everyone who had access to the area proved difficult. But perhaps the most frustrating detail involved the surveillance footage itself. The footage became the central piece of evidence in the entire case. And yet, for a significant period of time, it was not broadly released to the public. When clearer versions eventually circulated, the quality was extremely limited. Blurry, distant, incomplete. A person connected to one of the most famous missing person cases in America, reduced to a few obstructed frames. Almost from the very beginning, Jennifer Kesse's disappearance has spread far beyond Florida. Online forums began to delve into the case. Independent investigators, blogs, podcasts. Thousands of people are trying to unravel the mystery piece by piece. Over the years, a few main theories have come to dominate the discussion. One theory focused on a worker associated with the apartment complex. Another suggested that more than one person might have been involved. Some believed the answer might lie closer to Jennifer's personal life. But the most disturbing possibility is the simplest. What if the man in the videotape had nothing to do with the disappearance at all? What if investigators and the public had been focusing on the wrong figure for years, because it was the only figure they had? This possibility changes the entire case, because suddenly, the mystery becomes even more pervasive than the videotape itself. There is another detail in the case that receives far less attention. At the time of Jennifer Kesse's disappearance, construction work was still ongoing in parts of her apartment complex. According to later reporting, multiple contractors and subcontractors had access to the property. And in some instances, workers were reportedly hired informally, paid in cash, with limited documentation, sometimes with little reliable record of who had actually been there. For investigators, that creates a major problem, because when records are incomplete, timelines become difficult to verify, and potential witnesses become difficult to identify. In other words, people may have moved through Jennifer's building without leaving much trace behind at all.
More than a decade after Jennifer Kesse disappeared, the case was reviewed again by a specialized investigative unit. By that point, technology had changed, Image enhancement tools had improved, and investigators hoped the footage might finally reveal something new. The surveillance video was reanalyzed frame by frame, contrast adjusted, resolution enhanced where possible. The face still could not be clearly identified, but investigators noticed another detail. Something on the person's wrist, possibly a bracelet or a watch. Some kind of object catching light as the figure moved. A very small clue, but in cold cases, small clues are sometimes all that remain. Because after years of silence, even the smallest new detail can reopen an entire investigation. The enhanced video footage didn't show a face. No name was given, and that didn't suddenly solve the case. But it added another detail to the profile of the unidentified man. Investigators had been trying to identify for nearly 2 decades. And that's perhaps the most disturbing part of all of this. Because if this man was involved, then, statistically speaking, he's probably still alive. Somewhere, perhaps leading a perfectly ordinary life. Going to work, passing strangers in the traffic, existing unnoticed. And if they really know what happened to Jennifer Kesse, then 18 years, they held an answer that no one else had. 18 years. Drew Kesse and Joyce Kesse refused to let their daughter's case fade from public memory. They continued to speak publicly. They gave interviews. They insisted on answers from investigators. Year after year, they drew attention to the case. Because for the families of the missing, time passes abnormally. There is no real end. No certainty. Only anticipation. At one point, Drew Kesse described it this way: "Every morning I wake up and think of Jennifer, and every night I fall asleep thinking of her." It never stops. And perhaps, it's this part of these kinds of experiences that people forget the easiest. Disappearance doesn't happen once, for the family, it happens every single day after that. Based on the generally accepted chronology, many investigators and observers have come to a similar conclusion. Jennifer Kesse most likely disappeared sometime between 8 and 8:30 a.m. that morning. And if the chronology is correct, the meeting likely happened very quickly. One possibility is that whoever was responsible knew Jennifer's daily routine in advance, where she parked, when she left for work, when that location was least noticeable. This possibility would help explain why the sequence of events seems unusually controlled. The car was moved, abandoned in another complex, carefully parked, not recklessly abandoned. Psychological subtext: to some investigators, this suggests planning, not panic. Intentional actions taken to create confusion and delay the investigation. And if this interpretation is correct, whoever did this may have spent far more time thinking about Jennifer than Jennifer ever knew. But there is one part of the case that continues to trouble investigators and observers alike. If the individual in the footage really was connected to the construction work at the complex, then logically, someone should have recognized him. A supervisor, a co-worker, someone who saw him around the property. And yet, after all these years, no confirmed identification has ever emerged publicly. No verified statement saying, "I know who that person is." There are several possible explanations for that. The individual may have left the area quickly, worked temporarily, or existed on the margins of official records entirely. But investigators have also considered another uncomfortable possibility: that someone may have recognized more than they were willing to say. And in unresolved cases, silence can become just as difficult to interpret as evidence itself. What makes the Jennifer Kesse case so haunting is not the complete absence of evidence, because evidence exists. A timeline, a vehicle, surveillance footage, fragments of an answer. What makes the case unbearable is how close investigators may have come. A slightly clearer image, a different camera angle, a witness deciding that something felt wrong. One small detail changing at exactly the right moment. And maybe the entire mystery looks different. Maybe a face becomes visible. Maybe a name appears. maybe Jennifer comes home. That's what makes some cold cases so difficult to accept. Not that the truth disappeared completely, but that it may have passed within inches of being seen. On the morning of January 23, 2006, Jennifer Kesse finished a normal phone call and walked out of her apartment. Like any other workday. Routine, predictable, ordinary, she had no reason to believe that morning would be different from any other. No warning, no visible danger. But if investigators are right, someone else already knew exactly what was about to happen. And 18 years later, that person still has not been identified. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, hit the bell icon, and don't forget to subscribe.